Have you ever stopped to think about how the greatest empires of history didn't just fall to armies? They collapsed under the weight of their own pride? It's one of those haunting truths we see over and over again. Power builds, arrogance blinds, and then everything that once seemed untouchable begins to crumble. And no story captures that better than the fall of the mighty Roman Empire, a world that believed it was eternal, only to be humbled by those it once called barbarians. This isn't just a tale about battles and kings. It's a story about what happens when glory turns into greed, when pride blinds the powerful, and when those who were once oppressed rise up to demand justice. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you find yourself drawn to the hidden corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I am always amazed that we can explore these ancient narratives together, no matter where we are in the world, united by our curiosity about the past. Centuries ago, the name of Rome echoed like thunder. From the deserts of Africa to the cold hills of Britannia, its legions marched with unstoppable precision. The world bowed before its laws, its architecture, its culture. It was more than a city, it was an idea. The Roman Empire represented civilization itself. People believed as long as Rome stood, the world had order. But beneath that shining surface, cracks had already begun to spread. The empire was no longer the disciplined machine it once was. Greed had replaced honor, corruption had replaced loyalty, and politics had turned into poison. Rome was still vast, but inside it was rotting. And on the distant edges of its borders lived the so-called barbarians, tribes that the Romans mocked and despised. To the senators and generals of Rome, these people were uncivilized, unworthy of respect, their lives worth less than the marble under Roman feet. But to those tribes, Rome was a monster, a power that conquered their lands, enslaved their families, and crushed their spirit. And among those tribes were the Goths, a proud, fierce people who had fought to survive the cruelty of both nature and empire. When the terrifying Huns swept across the steppes of Europe, burning and destroying everything in their path, the Goths fled westward, desperate to find safety within Roman borders. They weren't seeking war, they were seeking refuge. But the empire that prided itself on law and order met them not with compassion, but with exploitation. Roman officials saw the Goths not as allies, but as opportunity, cheap labor, easy targets for corruption, and helpless pawns. They extorted them, starved them, and even sold their children into slavery. Imagine that, people begging for sanctuary from death, only to be pushed into a deeper hell by those they turned to for help. It was in that darkness that a leader rose, a man who would change the course of history. His name was Alaric. To Rome, he would become a curse. To his people, a savior. To history, a symbol of fate catching up with arrogance. Alaric was not just another warlord thirsting for blood. He had once served Rome. He had seen its brilliance, its structure, its discipline. He respected it, but he also saw the sickness festering beneath it. And when Rome betrayed his people, something inside him hardened. His loyalty to the empire died, replaced by a burning sense of justice and destiny. Alaric united the Goths under his banner. He promised not just revenge, but dignity. And when he spoke, men listened. They followed him not out of fear, but faith. They believed they were instruments of divine retribution, the hand of history coming to balance the scales. And so began a march that would shake the very foundations of the ancient world. The early clashes between the Goths and the Roman legions were brutal, unpredictable, and drenched in blood. But Alaric wasn't a fool. He knew Rome's strength wasn't just in its armies, but in its patience and manipulation. So he fought the same way. He struck quickly, then vanished. He negotiated when it suited him and attacked when they least expected it. His greatest weapon wasn't the sword, it was strategy. Inside Rome, the politicians panicked. The empire was already split between East and West, its power divided. Generals argued, emperors hesitated, and senators clung to their gold. Every decision they made only made things worse. Alaric watched and waited, letting Rome's arrogance do half his work for him. He didn't have to destroy the empire outright. All he had to do was expose what it had become. Across the countryside, Gothic banners rose where Roman eagles once flew. Entire provinces trembled as Alaric's forces advanced. Yet, unlike the image Rome had painted of barbarians, these warriors didn't destroy for pleasure. They didn't burn every city or massacre the innocent. Alaric's orders were clear. This was not a war of chaos, but of reckoning. They wanted acknowledgement, justice, and a future, but Rome refused to listen. The city still believed in its myth of invincibility. To the Roman elite, the idea that savages could threaten the eternal city was laughable. They held banquets, debated politics, and waited for someone else to fix the problem. They didn't realize that history doesn't wait for anyone. Outside their marble walls, the storm was already building. And when it arrived, it would wash away everything they believed could never fall. Imagine standing on the hills outside Rome in those days, watching the horizon glow with the fires of distant villages, hearing the faint thunder of thousands of footsteps marching closer. The people inside the city must have felt the tension like a ghost breathing down their necks. Rome, the empire that had conquered the known world, now faced its reckoning not from another empire, but from those it had once enslaved. The siege began, and as the days stretched into weeks, hunger replaced pride. The same citizens who once cheered for the legions were now begging for food. The same Senate that once ruled continents couldn't feed its own people. The great empire was starving inside and out, and Alaric, patient, cold, and calculating, simply waited. But Alaric wasn't driven by cruelty. He offered peace again and again. He sent envoys to the city, offering fair terms. He didn't demand gold or blood. He asked for land, for recognition, for coexistence. But the Roman Senate, blinded by arrogance, spat in his face. They would rather die than humble themselves before a barbarian. And that's when Alaric decided if Rome refused to listen to reason, then it would learn through ruin. The night the city fell was one of the darkest in history, not because of the fire and blood, but because of what it symbolized. The gates of the eternal city, believed to be untouchable, opened from within. Some say it was betrayal, others say it was destiny. But once those gates opened, there was no going back. The world shifted. As the gates of Rome creaked open, time itself seemed to stop. For nearly 800 years, the city had stood as the symbol of power, order, and eternity. And now, under the pale light of the moon, the unthinkable was happening. The Goths, those once scorned barbarians, were marching into the heart of the empire. It wasn't the clash of armies that marked this moment, but the deafening silence that came before the storm. For centuries, the Romans had believed their city was untouchable. But no wall, no god, no empire lasts forever. When Alaric's men entered, they didn't roar or celebrate. They moved through the streets like ghosts, their torches flickering against the marble statues of forgotten gods. The air was thick with the scent of fear. Behind every shuttered window, people trembled, waiting for the chaos they were sure would come. But what they saw instead was something they could never have imagined. The so-called barbarians showed restraint. They didn't slaughter without reason. They spared those who sought refuge in the churches. They respected the sacred, a gesture Rome itself had long forgotten. But that didn't mean the city escaped suffering. Hunger, panic, and desperation turned Rome into a nightmare. Gold meant nothing, status meant nothing. Survival was all that mattered. Soldiers abandoned their posts, nobles fled into the countryside, and slaves broke free, claiming the chaos as their chance for revenge. Fires broke out across the districts, their smoke rising like a funeral shroud over the empire. The sound of collapsing roofs echoed like the final heartbeat of a dying world. Alaric stood in the heart of it all, watching as the symbol of human dominance crumbled before him. This wasn't victory, it was vindication. He hadn't wanted to destroy Rome. He wanted Rome to see itself, to realize what it had become, a hollow shell of greed, corruption, and arrogance. The city that once gave law and order to the world had forgotten its own. And as Alaric looked upon the flames dancing across its temples, he must have felt the strange weight of triumph and sorrow intertwining. He had won, but at a cost that could never be undone. In the temples, the once mighty statues of gods stood helplessly as their city burned. Priests prayed to Jupiter and Mars, but their voices vanished into the smoke. The gods of Rome had fallen silent. The people who had once believed themselves chosen now whispered in despair, wondering if the divine had turned its back on them. Mothers clutched their children. Old men sat in the ruins of their homes, staring blankly at the horizon. The empire that had ruled the world had finally become the victim of its own creation. Yet even amid destruction, there were glimpses of humanity. Some Gothic soldiers shared food with the starving. Others protected women and the elderly, remembering their own families who had once suffered under Roman cruelty. There was chaos, yes, but there was also something deeply human. A reminder that even in vengeance, compassion can flicker like a candle in the dark. The sack lasted 3 days. 3 days that shook the ancient world to its core. When the fires finally died down, the once golden city stood scarred and broken. Its streets were littered with ash and silence. The Roman people, who once looked down on the world, now wandered like ghosts through their own ruins. They could hardly believe what had happened, how the eternal city had fallen not to a rival empire, but to the very people it had scorned. When word of the disaster spread across the world, it was as if the sun itself had gone dark. In distant lands, people whispered in disbelief. Merchants wept openly in marketplaces. Bishops and scholars wrote that the world was ending, that humanity had reached the final chapter of history. For centuries, Rome had been the anchor of civilization, and now that anchor had been ripped from the earth. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman court reacted with horror. Some rejoiced at the humiliation of their Western rivals, while others trembled, realizing what this truly meant. If Rome could fall, no city was safe. The idea of invincibility of eternal empire was gone forever. The old world was dying, and something new was waiting to be born in its ashes. But even in victory, Alaric's story was not one of triumph. He carried no joy from the ashes of Rome. He was a man who had seen too much blood, too much betrayal, too much loss. His dream had never been destruction. It had been dignity for his people. Yet now, surrounded by ruins, he understood that history rarely gives the ending we hope for. He allowed his men to take what they needed, then ordered them to leave the city. The sack was over. Rome had been humbled. The message had been delivered. As the Gothic army moved south, they carried not just loot, but a shadow, the heavy silence of what they had done. The people followed them, desperate for food and safety, but Alaric's path led towards something even more tragic. In the months that followed, storms battered his army. Supplies ran low. Disease spread through the ranks. And then, unexpectedly, fate struck its final blow. Alaric, the conqueror of Rome, the man who had brought the empire to its knees, fell ill and died. No one knows exactly how. Some say it was fever, others claim it was poison. But what we do know is that his men mourned him with a loyalty that defied history. They could not let the Romans find his body. They would never allow the empire to claim victory over him, even in death. So they buried him in secret. Legend says they diverted the course of a river, laid Alaric's body in its bed with his treasures, his sword, and the symbols of his people, then let the waters flow again. Every slave who worked on the burial was executed to ensure the secret would die with them. To this day, no one has found his grave. Somewhere beneath the earth of southern Italy, the man who broke Rome sleeps in silence, untouched, unknown, and eternal in memory. And maybe that's fitting, because Alaric wasn't just a conqueror, he was a mirror, a reflection of Rome's sins, its arrogance, its blindness. Through him, history didn't just change, it learned. The sack of Rome wasn't the end of civilization, but the beginning of a new era. The world that rose from its ashes, the medieval world, would be darker, yes, but also more human. For the first time in centuries, power no longer belonged to one empire alone. The age of empires had ended. The age of nations was about to begin. In the months and years that followed the sack, Rome tried to pretend it could still rise again. Senators returned to their broken villas, sweeping ashes from marble floors that would never shine the same way again. The people rebuilt markets, repaired statues, and reopened temples, as if restoring the city's stones could restore its soul. But something had changed, something deeper than any ruin or flame. The illusion was gone. For the first time in history, the Romans realized they were mortal. It wasn't just a city that had fallen, it was an idea. The idea that Rome was eternal, chosen by the gods, destined to rule forever. That myth had carried them for centuries, through wars and revolutions, through the rise and fall of countless emperors. But now, standing among their own ruins, even the proudest citizens could no longer deny the truth. Nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not kings, not even the mightiest of civilizations. The fall of Rome sent ripples across the world. Cities that once feared its legions now saw the empire as a relic of the past. The provinces that had been held together by force began to drift away. In Gaul, in Spain, in Africa, the seeds of new kingdoms began to sprout. The Western Empire was like a dying star, its light fading slowly, still bright but collapsing inward. And while many mourned the passing of the old order, others felt something stirring, a sense of possibility. For the first time, power was no longer centralized in one almighty empire. The world was breaking apart, yes, but in that chaos, new worlds were being born. Writers of the time struggled to make sense of what they had witnessed. Saint Jerome wrote that it felt as though the world itself had died. Others called it divine punishment, a reckoning for Rome's sins. Yet there were a few who saw it differently. They believed that history wasn't ending, but transforming. Just as the forests reclaimed the ruins of fallen cities, humanity was finding new paths through the debris of empire. And in a way, Alaric had become part of that transformation. Though the Romans called him a barbarian, history would come to see him as something far more complex, a man caught between two worlds. He admired Rome's greatness but despised its corruption. He wanted peace but was forced into war. He destroyed the city not out of hatred, but out of necessity. His story wasn't one of savagery. It was one of tragic inevitability. Over time, legends formed around his name. Some said that Alaric was cursed by the gods, destined to never find peace. Others claimed that he still rides beneath the earth, guarding his hidden tomb, waiting for the day the world needs to be reminded again that pride always comes before the fall. Whatever the truth, his shadow stretches across history like an unending echo, a reminder that even the greatest powers can be brought low by the smallest acts of arrogance. As the centuries passed, Rome's ruins became monuments, silent witnesses to the cycle of human ambition. Travelers from distant lands came to see what remained of the eternal city. They walked through its broken arches, touched its cracked stones, and felt the weight of time pressing down. Every fallen column, every shattered statue whispered the same truth. Power is temporary, but legacy endures. And maybe that's what makes this story so haunting. Because deep down, we all build our own Romes, our dreams, our ambitions, our empires of pride. We believe they'll stand forever. But history, again and again, reminds us that the same forces that build greatness can also destroy it. The same fire that forges empires can consume them. When we think of Rome's fall, it's easy to see it as tragedy. But maybe, just maybe, it was something more. Maybe it was nature's way of resetting the balance, of reminding humanity that no single power should rule forever. The fall of Rome didn't end civilization. It gave birth to a new one. Out of the ashes came new cultures, new kingdoms, new ideas. The Dark Ages weren't the end. They were the beginning of something different, something raw and human. If you look closely, you can still feel Rome's heartbeat today. In our languages, our laws, our architecture, our dreams of greatness. The empire may have fallen, but its spirit was never buried. It simply changed shape, living on through the very people who once tore it down. That's the paradox of history. Destruction is never truly the end. It's transformation in disguise. So when you walk among the ruins, real or metaphorical, remember this. Every great fall starts not with weakness, but with pride. The moment we start believing we're untouchable is the moment our foundations begin to crack. Rome wasn't destroyed by the Goths alone. It was destroyed by its own reflection, by the arrogance that blinded it to its own decay. And in that sense, maybe the story of Rome isn't just history. Maybe it's a warning, whispered through time to every generation that rises too high, too fast. Because no matter how powerful we become, how much we build, or how far we reach, the lesson remains the same. Nothing is eternal. Everything, from empires to ambitions, eventually bends to the will of time. Yet, there's something strangely beautiful in that truth. Because even though all things fall, what we create, what we learn, and what we pass on, that's what really lasts. The stones may crumble, but the story never dies. Rome's fire still burns, not in its walls, but in our imagination, in our understanding of what it means to build, to lose, and to rise again. And so, the story of Rome's fall isn't one of defeat. It's one of rebirth. From the ashes of arrogance came humility. From the ruins of empire came the dawn of nations. And from the fall of a city came the reminder that no matter how far humanity falls, it always finds a way to stand again. So the next time you look at the ruins of Rome, don't see the end of greatness. See the beginning of renewal. Because that's what history truly is. A cycle of rise, fall, and rebirth. Alaric's name may be buried beneath the river, his bones lost to time, but his story, the story of pride, consequence, and redemption, will forever flow through the veins of history, reminding us that even the mightiest empires must eventually bow to time. And as the camera fades on the crumbling stones of the eternal city, the echoes of the past still whisper through the wind. A soft, almost mournful voice that says, "Nothing lasts forever, but everything leaves a mark."